zombies, shamblers, walkers. These people turned flesh-eating monsters are deeply ingrained in our modern popular culture. We can't seem to get enough of these bloodthirsty bastards, and you don't have to look very long to find media featuring them, whether it be books, TV shows, movies, and naturally video games. But as common as they are now, there was a period in gaming in the late 2000s, early 2010s, where every developer seemed to jump on the zombie craze at the same time, leading to a torrent of Z-led titles. Call of Duty's famous mode got its start then, Left 4 Dead, of course, Dead Island, Plants vs. Zombies, DayZ, which never got finished, Red Dead Redemption and Yakuza both got post-apocalyptic spin-offs. These are just some of the more well-known ones. The masses ate these things up. While we're on the topic of shambling corpses, the Wii U! Nintendo's ill-fated follow-up to its market-dominating console, the Wii U launched in 2012 and failed to catch on. It was marketed poorly, the name led to confusion, with many believing it to be an add-on accessory instead of a brand new system, and its bulky gamepad was seen more as a cute gimmick than a true innovation. Its launch lineup didn't do it any favors either, featuring a tech demo, a Mario game that looked exactly like the previous one, and a smattering of ports of games that were already out on other systems for months. There just wasn't all that much to get excited about. However, there was always one particular launch title for that doomed console that managed to stand out to me, despite releasing in the middle of an undead craze that was already beginning to get old. A little survival horror game dubbed ZombiU. Developed by Ubisoft back before they sold their soul, ZombiU began its life as a raving rabid spin-off dubbed Killer Freaks from Outer Space, yes, really, before being reworked into the much more familiar zombie genre. The simple fact that this was a game about infected flesh eaters was plenty to differentiate it from the colorful, family-friendly stuff Nintendo offered, but that's not why I remember it. That's not why it's the game I think of whenever the Wii U comes up. I've played tons of zombie games before. I've slaughtered biters in the many of thousands, but even after a decade, I still haven't played anything quite like ZombiU, both in good and bad ways. It isn't the best survival horror game ever made by any stretch. Actually, it's really easy to see how someone could hate it, but there's something about it. It's unique, it's interesting, it's janky as hell, but at times it manages to have moments of tension other horror titles dream of. ZombiU is not for everyone, but it is for me, and I'm going to do my best to explain why. An outbreak referred to as the Blight has turned jolly old London into a haven for the walking dead. You play as a random survivor wandering the infested streets alone when a voice on a loudspeaker beckons you toward a safe house. This voice belongs to the Prepper, a bitter, fatalistic man who saw the fall coming and believes that surviving as long as possible is all that's left now. He offers shelter and equipment in exchange for you going out into the night to scavenge supplies, as he offers advice and insight via radio. As you do this, you learn more about the plague, a prophecy by 17th century scholar John Dee.
Dee's nuts.
A secret society based around him called the Ravens of Dee that are looking for a cure, and maybe there's supernatural stuff going on. It's hinted at, but never really expanded upon. Honestly, the story of ZombiU is a bit unfocused, and more of a background thing. You only run into a few other living characters that try to flesh out the world with expository radio chatter, and collectible notes fill in some gaps, but none of it has ever grabbed me. Though there is something I've always liked about the Prepper's smug, jaded attitude toward everything, the actor portraying him sells it really well.
These poor buggers have to fend for themselves. Abandoned by the government, the so-called public servants, who all hot-footed it to Westminster and the palace instead. That little good it did them, eh?
You've probably already noticed from the brief amount of footage you've seen so far, but ZombiU isn't the most attractive game. It never was. It's dark, grimy, washed out looking, blurry, there's a greenish, yellowish tint to the whole thing. It wouldn't be inaccurate to call what you're looking at a bit ugly. But to play devil's advocate, all of those elements contribute to the oppressive, hopeless atmosphere the world is trying to convey. Wandering the rainy streets of London, bashing the formerly living over the head would be a pretty bleak, ugly existence, and the general look of ZombiU lends itself to that. Because of this atmosphere, no matter where you are, even if you know for sure you've cleared an area, you still never feel totally safe. Though before, when I said the game was dark, I meant dark. Really dark. Like hard to see sometimes dark. Even if you have the in-game flashlight on, adjust the brightness, and crank up your monitor's contrast like I did, it can still be difficult to make stuff out. It's a horror game, I know, darkness tends to be part of the deal, and the harshness of it can be a strength, making you second-guess whether or not you saw something lurking in the shadows, but it's pushed so far as to occasionally be a player hindrance. But maybe the lack of lighting is meant to hide something else, because other things about the presentation are just kind of poor. While taking on undead, you'll see the same few stock swing, stumble, and kill animations over and over and over again, some of which can be jittery depending on the room layout. Enemy models shamelessly repeat themselves everywhere you go, though credit where it's due, most places at least have a few unique ones that fit the location they're in. The frame rate is kind of all over the place. Pop-in of environmental details, even zombies themselves, is common. You'll become intimately familiar with this 20 to 30 second long loading screen when moving between zones, and even after that, sometimes you still have to wait at a door while the area behind it renders in. And if you have a fetish for repetitive grunts of disgust and exhaustion, then by God, ZombiU is the title for you. But contrary to what some believe, how a game looks isn't anywhere near as important as how a game plays, and ZombiU is also a bit clunky in that department too. But first, let's talk about the Wii U Gamepad, because its implementation goes a long way. It's one of the big things that makes this experience unique from so many other games of its type. You might notice a lack of any real HUD elements in this video, and that's because they all live on the second screen you're holding in your hand. Any interaction you have in ZombiU outside of direct combat takes place on the gamepad. Every time you look in your backpack, loot a container, pick a lock or remove a barricade, hop on a turret or scope in with a sniper rifle, you have to look away from your TV or monitor and use the secondary touchscreen. There's also a scanning mode you can bring up to mark objects in the environment, but I never really found that feature to be all that necessary. While exploring, the pad also serves an important role as a map and threat detector. Aside from seeing the general layout of where you are, you can send out a radar ping, something you have to manually do at first, that will highlight any creature in the environment with a red dot. It doesn't just point out wandering biters, rats and birds will give off a signal too, so you still have to pay attention to your surroundings. On the flip side of this, there are a few times where the game blatantly cheats and won't ping something to allow a scripted ambush to happen, so you can't rely on it 100%. But you will be glancing at the map often to check for danger, once again requiring you to divert attention away from the main screen. One of the criticisms levied at the Wii U's bulky tablet is that it distracted from whatever game you were playing. It's jarring to have your attention divided between two screens, to the point where most developers started ignoring its implementation entirely to avoid the handicap. But ZombiU fully embraces it and is all the better for it. The actions you do on the gamepad are simple. You're either tapping on something or dragging objects, but not looking at what's directly in front of you in a game like this, even for a second, adds so much to the tension. There's a paranoia that comes from having to take your eyes off potential threats to grab something out of your bag or open a locked room, even if the overwhelming majority of the time you aren't in any real danger. It's a wonderfully effective illusion. When you're in a brawl with a couple zombies and you think something might be coming up behind you, looking down to quickly check your radar, darting your eyes back and forth between the two screens, adds to a feeling of panic that no other title really offers. No matter the game's other faults, the decision to embrace the gamepad, playing both to its strengths and weaknesses, was a fantastic call, and helps make ZombiU at least a little bit special. What also helps the game feel distinct is just how vulnerable the player is. It only takes a handful of swipes from a shambler to end you. For the first few hours, being grabbed by one is an instant kill, and when the survivor you're playing as dies, they're dead for good. You'll then be put in the shoes of a new silent prepper lackey and have to go on a corpse run to reclaim any supplies you were previously carrying. This amplifies the consequences of any mistakes. Mistime a swing or fail to check a blind spot and it could cost you. Just one zombie can feel like a threat thanks to their resilience, and 2 or more requires some degree of patience and planning to deal with. Which is what your trusty cricket bat is for. Stealth isn't really an option here, levels are too cramped to allow for any tiptoeing, so you'll be dealing with almost every infected you come across. Firearms are always an option for this, there's actually a healthy amount of them to find throughout your journey, but you'll naturally want to conserve ammo, and limited inventory space prevents you from carrying an armory, so 90% of the time, you'll be bonking zombies over the head. The cricket bat you start with is the one and only melee weapon ZombiU has, and there's no way to improve its damage or anything. What you see is what you get. It's a bit clunky to wield since each swing requires a second of wind-up you have to compensate for, forcing you to be deliberate with your attacks. You can't simply spam it. Hit and run is the general tactic you'll default to for encounters, especially since the Blight seems to have given all your opponents pretty thick skulls. Unless you get a lucky crit, walkers take several hits to pacify, usually 5 on average, but some can take double that. Against one enemy, this isn't a big deal, since there's nothing stopping you from repeatedly following up. But when against more than that, you have to pick your shots, as the sluggishness of your attack can easily leave you open. When possible, it's best to separate groups into more manageable numbers so they don't overwhelm you. Now, seeing the same one swing animation again and again, coupled with the sponginess of your opponents, might make ZombiU's combat seem tedious or mind-numbing. That is the end of that sentence. There's no getting around the fact that this repetitive dance does get old, and you can't really avoid it. Dealing with undead will get dull sooner or later, and at a point, you'll sort of end up going through the motions. But inevitably, something will happen. You won't necessarily die, but maybe you'll misjudge a swing or accidentally corner yourself, and in those moments, all the tension and panic floods back in, if only briefly. Then you'll fall back into the familiar rhythm until the next time you have a close call, and the cycle repeats. Now, I'm not going to pretend that excuses the monotony of combat. I'm not trying to argue its secretly brilliant design, and if this looks boring to you, yeah, it absolutely can be. All I'm saying is that the tedium sometimes works to the game's advantage, whether intentional or not. There are other annoyances, however, I don't have any excuses for. Flashlights that drain battery should not be a thing in games, especially when turning it off for a few seconds fully recharges it anyway. This doesn't add anything to the experience except annoyance. Just have the flashlight be infinite. I've mentioned this pet peeve of mine before on this channel, and I will point it out every time I see it, because it's dumb. Stop doing it! If you're the type of person that hoards all the resources they possibly can, like you're someone who finds a stash and takes the time to run it all the way back home, the storage chest in your safe house will get full very quickly, and managing that space can be a pain. It wasn't long before I had to start dropping stuff on the floor and letting it despawn just to make some room. On the topic of inventory management, for some odd reason, your cricket bat and default pistol, 2 items every new survivor starts with, can never be removed from your bag. You are stuck with them from beginning to end. For the bat, this kinda makes sense, since there's no other melee options, there's no reason not to have it with you, but there are a couple other handguns to find, and if you want to use them, you're forced to waste an inventory slot carrying the other. These aren't, like, essential puzzle items or anything, so why are they forever glued to my person? My biggest complaint, though, are the D letters. A third of the way into the game, you're asked to locate 7 letters written by John Dee to help with a scientist's research. The first one is given to you for free, meaning you're actually only finding 6, so you set off to each marked location to track them down as instructed. What the game fails to tell you, however, is that this is an impossible task. You cannot collect most of the letters yet, because you don't have the necessary tools needed to access where they're hidden. You just have to pretend this mission doesn't exist until near the end when everything else has been done. But even if you could collect them all out of the gate, it boils down to backtrack-heavy busywork that slows the game's pace to a halt. They probably should have been cut altogether. It's also worth mentioning that there were some online integrations with ZombiU. There were leaderboard rankings based on how long players could survive on a single life. You could leave symbols spray-painted on walls for others to find, though most people ignored these since the messages were so unclear as to be useless. And you could randomly find the shambling corpses of other survivors that perished and loot their packs for whatever they had on them at the time. Cool ideas, but I'm talking about all this in the past tense, as the online services for the game were shut down just recently. So recently, in fact, that I accidentally watched the servers die in the final hours of my playthrough. Didn't even realize this shutdown was happening, and because of this coincidence, I may very well have been the last person in the world to play ZombiU with online intact. While this game certainly had its fans, ZombiU got mixed critical reception when it came out, and didn't end up selling very well. I mean, it was a third-party title on the Wii U. It was preordained to flop. So in an effort to recoup some of their losses, Ubisoft ported the title to other systems a few years later. Dropping the U from the name, since it wouldn't make much sense anymore, this port/remaster is simply called Zombi, and is the most easily accessible version of the game these days. I hadn't played it before, but I do own it on Xbox One, so I thought it would be worthwhile to see how the interesting but imperfect experience I'm familiar with translated to a different platform. I played about 3.5 hours of it, or until the helicopter crash to be specific, and I have thoughts. Aside from an overall sharper look and higher resolution, the most obvious change up front is the lack of a gamepad to utilize, so UI elements had to be added back to the main screen. The map is awkwardly slapped on the bottom right at all times, a placement I find weird as it completely covers half of your model. Opening your backpack or interacting with objects is now done via a menu, though when looting containers it tended to glitch out pretty bad. And actions that once required tapping are now done with button mashing. I'm just gonna say it, the lack of a second screen really takes away from the gameplay. The panic and tension that was previously there completely evaporates when your eyes are glued to what's in front of you. The map and radar pings are always in your periphery, and while the pop-up menus try to obscure your view, that's not the same as having to totally look away. You'd think that fighting zombies wouldn't change all that much, but you'd be wrong. One addition I will praise is the inclusion of 2 new melee weapons. You still start with the cricket bat, but now you can find a shovel and a nail-covered baseball bat to use. They don't feel drastically different to wield, but some variety is appreciated, even if the cricket bat still can't be removed from your bag for some reason. It's the combat itself I take issue with. Likely in response to feedback about the original being too slow or boring, this version overcorrects in the name of speed, and makes fighting hordes stupidly easy. The 5 or so hits it used to take to KO a zombie has been reduced to 2 or 3, and your swing is much faster. Because of this, I can easily charge forward with full confidence that I'll be fine. Any and all threat the undead once posed is gone. You're pretty much unstoppable. Now, some people will probably see this as a positive change. It improves the pacing and makes combat less of a chore. Cool, if that's what you prefer, but it also makes the game more bland and mindless. There are some other nitpicks I have, like having to hold the thumbstick down to sprint, whereas before it was a toggle, the complete inability to move objects around in your inventory, and they didn't bother including the online features at all. But at the end of the day, the core loop being so different is what makes it hard for me to recommend Zombi. It's not a bad game, and if it's the only way you can play it, you might like it okay. It's certainly more approachable, but it lacks much of what made ZombiU cool. If this updated version of the game was all there ever was, I don't think many people would ever give it a second thought. My advice, if you can play the original release on Wii U as intended, you absolutely should over this port. Over the years, I've seen an occasional review that declares ZombiU a misunderstood masterpiece of survival horror, and if you ask me, they're overselling it a bit. The game is rough in a lot of ways, you have to know that going in, and I can't guarantee you'll come away enjoying it. But there's a good chance you'll at least remember it. ZombiU doesn't look nor play the best, but it manages to stand out in a very crowded genre. It makes great use of the gamepad to amp up tension, and while the combat does get monotonous, it comes with the benefit of making an all-too-familiar enemy feel threatening again. I see ZombiU in a similar way to Death Stranding. I like it, but whenever someone tells me they don't, my response is going to be, yeah, fair enough. But I do encourage you to at least give it a try if you have the option to. Maybe you'll come away with a similar appreciation as me. At the end of all this, there's nothing quite like ZombiU, and I think that itself is worth acknowledging, because I'd rather play something janky and memorable than something polished and forgettable.